Strictly speaking, a coffin is just a special container used for transporting, laying out, and burying a loved one. However, a closer look at the various burial rituals shows that not all coffins are the same. It doesn't matter whether it's lavishly decorated ancient Egyptian sarcophagi, mystical tree coffins, or glass Snow White coffins. When it comes to laying a person to rest, people get pretty creative. Today, we'll be covering some scary stories of coffins that have been discovered over the years, as well as eerie urban legends about strange burial rituals. But before we get into it, make sure you hit that like button and ring the notification bell for more videos. Also, stick around until the end to learn about one of the strangest coffins ever discovered. A coffin in your own garden. Nowhere else is life so carefree as in your own four walls. Far from the eyes of the public, we can relax and unwind without caring what anyone else thinks of us. However, the situation becomes tricky when the idyllic atmosphere of your own home is disturbed by inexplicable events. Imagine you're sitting comfortably on the sofa and all of a sudden you hear loud footsteps in the attic, even though all the other family members are in the living room with you. What sounds like a scary scene from a horror movie at first glance was part of the uncanny reality for John and Erica Carner for many years. The San Francisco couple couldn't come up with an explanation for the mysterious footsteps above their heads. Although the two Americans had two children themselves, the mysterious noises also occurred when the little ones were playing happily in the garden or had been lying in their beds. Regular glances in the attic didn't provide any new insights. Neither an animal nor any other uninvited guest had made itself comfortable there. Eventually, it was a sheer coincidence that brought the supposed source of these supernatural events to light. The Carner family hired a construction company to help them come up with a new design for their garden. When the builders got to work, they soon made a gruesome discovery. A little girl's coffin had been lying under the flower beds and manicured lawn the whole time. The coffin was made of metal and had two viewing windows in the lid. Since the coffin was closed very tightly at the time, the young girl was still remarkably well preserved. With the help of modern DNA analysis, the summoned experts succeeded in determining the identity of the child. Therefore, we know today that this was the young Edith Howard Cook, who passed on October 13, 1876, at the age of just 2 years old. But how did it happen that the toddler was laid to rest in the garden of a house of all places? As you can probably already imagine, modern neighborhoods did not always consist of just conventional single-family houses. In fact, the corresponding area was used as a burial ground until the beginning of the 20th century. When the cemetery was finally closed, all the remains were to be exhumed and transferred to another cemetery, all but Edith Cook's. Why the girl was left in her original grave more than 100 years ago is unknown. What is certain is that the discovery of her body and the subsequent transfer to an intact cemetery was accompanied by a remarkable event. From the day Edith left the Carner's garden, the footsteps in the attic were to fall silent forever. Hanging coffins. Earth to earth, ashes to ashes, dust to dust. This often quoted formula explains why we lay our loved ones to rest in the ground of all places. Thus, the idea behind this form of burial is that we bring people back to where they came from. According to the biblical story of creation, Adam, the first man, was created from clay. So, while most of us adhere to the official story of creation and lay our loved ones to rest accordingly, things were completely different in a certain region of China many years ago. In fact, people here once preferred not to bury the coffins of their dead in the ground, but rather mount the coffins to the side of a mountain. The background to this extraordinary custom is still a big mystery. However, the researchers assumed that this was a ritual that was thousands of years old. However, the people who introduced this type of burial no longer exist today, which is why we may never know what was really behind the hanging coffins. Particularly bizarre is the fact that the corresponding rock faces are also adorned with countless bone fragments. As is well known, even a coffin that's been attached to a mountain does not last forever, and at some point begins to disintegrate and reveal its contents. Miniature coffins. The year is 1836, and a group of children is hare hunting near Edinburgh. As the little ones rush after their hopping prey, a strange detail suddenly catches their eye. As curious as children are, the little ones decide to get to the bottom of the mysterious formations, which are half covered with dirt. What they then bring to light is far more bizarre than conventional rabbits. In fact, the children came across 17 tiny wooden coffins. In detail, the disturbing containers were just 10 centimeters long. Even scarier than the miniature coffins were their contents. The objects did not contain the mortal remains of small animals, for example, but rather wooden dolls with wide-open eyes carved into their faces. The children's chilling discovery was soon spread among the rest of the population. While some residents believed that these were the relics of a black magic ritual, others suspected that the dolls were actually the bodies of dead goblins. To date, no indication has been found as to who made the wooden coffins or what purpose they served. Emperor Alexander's empty coffin. According to official history, Alexander I died in 1825 after a short, serious illness. But soon after the death of the Russian emperor was announced, the first people began to claim that the powerful monarch was in fact still alive and kicking. However, these legends were fueled by the strange circumstances surrounding the autopsy and the subsequent burial. Thus, during the final examination, the dead man's face was covered with a cloth at the urgent orders of his widow. While the deceased was then transferred back to St. Petersburg, no one was allowed to look inside the coffin. Many years later, the rumor about the faked death of the emperor would really pick up momentum again. Since Alexander II, Alexander I's nephew, wanted to get to the bottom of the never-ending legends about his uncle, he had the coffin opened in 1866. The incredible result was that the coffin was empty. Due to these inexplicable circumstances, many people are still convinced that the Russian ruler only faked his death in order to voluntarily go into secret exile. In fact, over time, many people reported seeing Alexander I as an old man many years later. At the time, it wouldn't be too much of a stretch to assume that the man had simply gotten tired of the countless hours he'd spent ruling over his country. After all, being the leader of a nation is very tiring. A look back in history shows that Alexander would have ruled over Russia for around 24 years, give or take. Thus, it's easy to understand that he may have simply grown tired and wanted to spend the rest of his days in hiding. This really begins to make sense when you consider the fact that he may have been looked down upon by his peers and followers if he simply quit and handed the role down to someone else. Up to this point, the role of the ruler was almost exclusively handed down to relatives after the ruler's death. This means that if a ruler didn't want to rule anymore, he may be seen as a quitter, or worse yet, he may even be seen as a traitor by his followers. Thus, it's fairly easy to understand why Alexander faking his death would make a lot of sense, even if the truth would come out many years later. Cursed sarcophagus. Alexander the Great is one of the most famous, most well-documented individuals in ancient history, though Alexander's life and death hold countless mysteries that to this day remain unsolved. Alexander the Great was known to have ruled over Greece until about 323 BC, when he suddenly became ill and passed away about 2 weeks later. Many people believe that Alexander had been poisoned after entering Babylon, though recent discoveries and investigations may prove that Alexander simply became sick and that his death was, for all accounts and purposes, a mistake. Around the time of Alexander's death, there were countless suspects who claimed to have witnessed his poisoned state firsthand, including his wife, his brother, and many civilians. However, one very important part of history that was never witnessed was the actual poisoning itself, the act of Alexander becoming poisoned. This naturally leaves a lot of room for doubt, and in today's world, poisoning certainly wouldn't be the first assumption. In fact, many of the symptoms that Alexander displayed during his final days, such as high fever, sweats, and abdominal pain, could even be explained by something as simple as food poisoning, or more likely, malaria. Now, this may simply sound like a conspiracy theory at first, and in a way it is, but the fact remains that there's more than enough room to cast reasonable doubt on the fact that Alexander was poisoned. Though we may finally know for sure in the coming years if a handful of archaeologists have their way and are allowed to survey and possibly dig at the gravesite of Alexander the Great. With today's technology, we may finally be able to find out if Alexander was affected by a virus, a type of food poisoning, or if he was legitimately poisoned by those who opposed him. However, there's one small hitch with this plan that you may already know about. No one knows where this man was buried. Yes, the tomb of Alexander the Great has never been uncovered, and all these years later, experts have no idea where he was laid to rest. Legend says that his body was preserved with honey and buried somewhere in Alexandria. According to various reports, his tomb was supposed to have been beautifully decorated so that he would have had everything he may ever need in the afterlife. With this said, it stands to reason that if his tomb is ever found, it will likely be filled with ancient relics that are worth millions of dollars. Though, to this day, we have no idea where Alexander's resting place may truly be hiding. Vampire Grave. In Connecticut, it doesn't matter whether it's inexplicable occurrences, devastating waves of disease, or mysterious deaths. If you ask the superstitious populace a few centuries ago about the cause of these tragedies, the answer was always the same: vampires. Fearing nothing more than an undead bloodsucker rising from its grave and returning to the world of the living, humans then performed exceedingly bizarre burial rituals intended to imprison the monster in the afterlife forever. The story of an old coffin found in the U.S. state of Connecticut a few decades ago also shows how disturbing such customs really were. The deceased, who died an estimated 200 years ago, was undoubtedly mistaken for a vampire by those around him. For this reason, some organs, such as the heart, were removed from the deceased after death and then burned. Even stranger, apparently the supposed vampire was buried twice. It's believed that the relatives of the deceased only decided after the first burial to exhume the deceased and have the cruel vampire rituals performed. The ritualistic burials of vampires didn't stop there, though. In many parts of the world, vampires would have been buried upside down, or they would have even had bricks lodged in their mouths, believing that this would keep their souls trapped within their bodies. These days, we understand that vampires don't actually exist. However, back then, people were very concerned that vampires not only existed, but that they essentially couldn't die. Thus, they went to any means necessary to keep the souls of vampires trapped within their bodies so that they wouldn't come back and haunt the world of the living. All right, everyone, now it's your turn. What do you think of these coffins that were found and the chilling stories that accompany them? We're looking forward to your comments. If our trip into the world of bizarre coffins has interested you, please give us a thumbs up. And while you're at it, don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss another video. Thanks for watching. Have a good one and see you next time.